I remember that afternoon at the supermarket with unnerving clarity, as if each moment were seared into my memory by a brand of cold fear. It was early spring, though the day felt prematurely warm, an impossible warmth that might have been a good omen on another day. The world smelled of budding leaves and moist earth as I pulled into the store parking lot, noting the surprising brightness of the sun and the mild breeze that carried the faint scent of cut grass from a distant landscaping crew. This was supposed to be a simple errand: pick up groceries for dinner, maybe a treat for our oldest kids, something sweet to celebrate the upcoming weekend. We had done this countless times before. My husband had come along, and with him, our youngest daughter, who, at just a few months old, seemed to have an uncanny internal barometer for tension and impatience. She had been fussy that morning, inconsolable in her usual ways, uninterested in her pacifier and squirming in that manner that always made me wonder if her diaper was at fault or if her gums were irritating her. We had decided on a tactic that often worked magic: a short drive around the block, the gentle hum of the engine, and the subtle rocking motion that settled her like nothing else. And so he took her while I was inside the store, expecting that, by the time I finished shopping, she'd be well into a peaceful slumber. As I navigated the supermarket's aisles, tossing a bag of apples, a carton of milk, and a package of chicken breasts into the cart, I had no reason to feel uneasy. I had done this mundane routine hundreds of times. My phone signal was weak inside the building, as it often was, reducing my husband and me to a half-forgotten era where immediate contact wasn't guaranteed. Yet I trusted him completely. He would settle our baby, then return to the parking lot to wait. The day was too nice to remain cooped up in the car, he must have reasoned. And so, once the baby was calm and dozing, he took her in her carrier and sat on one of the benches outside the store's entrance. It was near a small planter of neatly trimmed shrubs and rose bushes. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, making dappled patterns on the pavement and on my husband's jeans. There were other shoppers milling about, a few older couples, a tired-looking mother corralling twin toddlers, a pair of college students chatting animatedly. Beneath the store's green awning, painted in the chain signature colors, my husband settled in with our daughter, rocking her carrier absent-mindedly while taking a quick business call on his cell phone. And then she approached. I would piece this together later, but at the time I had no inkling of the events unfolding outside. The woman who approached my husband gave off no warning signals. By everyone's accounts, my husband's description, the bystanders' recollections, she was in her mid-30s, well-dressed in pressed slacks and a stylish blouse. Her hair was shoulder-length, a warm brown with subtle highlights, pulled back on one side with a small barrette. She moved with a certain crisp confidence that suggested she belonged in places like this: suburban supermarkets on sunny afternoons. It's not unusual for strangers, especially those drawn to the radiant purity of a new baby, to ask for a peek or a chance to coo over tiny fingers and toes. With our daughter's round rosy cheeks and her tuft of golden hair that caught the light, she was a magnet for compliments and all. My husband, who had encountered this scenario countless times, was prepared with a polite refusal. She was napping now, best not to disturb her. He tried to say this, raising his free hand in a gentle, apologetic gesture, his phone call trailing off into silence as he focused on this unexpected intruder into their peaceful moment. The woman didn't even pause. According to my husband's shaken recollection, she came right up to the carrier's handle, as if the baby inside already belonged to her. He must have thought she didn't hear him. He reiterated, "She's napping, please don't." But before he could form a complete sentence, she reached down and grasped the carrier's handle. There was no hesitation. With a single, fluid motion, she lifted our baby up and began walking away. At first, my husband told me he was simply stunned. The audacity, the impossibility of the situation made him question his own eyes. People don't just walk up and steal a baby in broad daylight. Surely this was a misunderstanding. Some surreal moment where this stranger might have mistaken my husband and child for someone else. Perhaps she thought he was a babysitter or a friend. But as she continued walking, her pace accelerating slightly, the terrible truth began to crystallize. That's when he said the first words that anyone else would later recall. "Excuse me, put her down." His voice was firm and urgent, echoing off the concrete walkway and the parked cars. A few heads turned. It sounded odd enough. A man yelling at a woman carrying a baby carrier. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she walked faster, her heels clicking briskly on the pavement, and her posture stiffened as if deflecting accusation. My husband's panic mounted. He scrambled off the bench, hard hammering, and sprinted after her. He reached out and grabbed the carrier's edge, trying to wrench it free. She held on stubbornly, making it bob dangerously. The baby began to cry in protest at the sudden jostling. My husband could hear her wail slicing through the air, and that sound nearly paralyzed him with fear. He eased up on jerking the carrier itself, afraid of harming our daughter, and instead tried to restrain the woman's arms. She twisted away, and only then did she speak, though it was not what he expected. She cried out, loud and shrill, "Help! He's trying to take my baby! Kidnapping! Call 911!" Her voice cut through the ambient noise like a siren. In that instant, the dynamics of the situation flipped upside down. A crowd gathered on the edges of the parking lot, turning their heads toward the commotion. There stood my husband, an average man dressed casually, maybe in a t-shirt bearing a comic book character, something unthreatening in any other context, and this poised, well-dressed woman. She was petite compared to him, and her voice shook with a seemingly genuine terror. The baby carrier was in her grip, and as she screamed, several bystanders began running toward them. My husband's pleas, "She's my daughter! She's taking my baby!" were swallowed by the woman's well-timed performance of victimhood. Her hair fell in artful disarray around her face, and she kept shouting variations of the same accusation, escalating the urgency, painting a portrait of a desperate mother fighting off a child abductor. He tried to protest, tried to explain, but he was cut short by a heavy blow. A man, someone I had later learned was a well-meaning stranger who truly believed he was acting heroically, tackled my husband to the asphalt. The air left his lungs as he hit the ground. He landed awkwardly on one shoulder, pain shooting up his arm, and before he could scramble upright, another set of hands pinned him down. He could hear the woman's hurried footsteps fading away, the carrier rustling with my baby's shrieks, and he shouted in agony, "She's my daughter! Please, you have to stop her!" But no one believed him. All they could see was a frantic man chasing after a seemingly terrified mother. The crowd closed ranks around my husband, pushing his arms against the ground, holding him in place with their knees and elbows. He heard fragments of enraged commands. "Stay down! You sick bastard! What kind of monster tries to steal a child?" Voices hissed with moral outrage. Someone mentioned calling the police, and a chorus of agreement followed. Another voice rose, suggesting that the woman should file a police report, that they must keep this man subdued until authorities arrived. My husband struggled, panic gripping every fiber of his being, choking him. He had to get free. Every second counted. That woman, with her carefully maintained facade, was absconding with our baby, and no one seemed to notice or care. Inside the store, I was finishing up my shopping. My cart contained everything we needed for the week. I recall pausing at a shelf of granola bars, debating which flavor our older kids would prefer, when I heard a muffled uproar coming from outside. The store's automatic doors hissed open every few seconds, admitting customers, but the commotion was distant and muted. I paid it no mind at first. I wish I had looked sooner. I wish I'd bolted outside the moment I heard a raised voice. But hindsight is cruel. Instead, I lingered, checking my list on my phone. No signal, of course, and finally rolled toward the checkout lanes. The cashier asked if I found everything I needed, and I think I nodded absently. I remember her scanning my items, the beep of the scanner, the rustle of plastic bags. Behind me, a customer was flipping through a magazine. It was all so normal inside, so deceptively calm. Then I stepped out. My eyes darted around, taking in the scene. Several people were gathered near the entrance, and I saw a cluster of individuals holding someone down on the pavement. My first absurd thought was that a fight had broken out or a thief had tried to snatch a purse. I scanned the crowd for my husband. A cold, clawing anxiety gripped me when I didn't see him near the bench where I had expected him. I rushed forward, my feet tapping hard against the ground. I glanced around frantically. Where was he? Where was the baby? As I drew closer, I recognized his voice. He was the one pinned under two men, gasping for breath, shouting, "Please! You have to stop that woman! She's taking my baby!" His voice sounded ragged, desperate beyond anything I'd ever heard from him before. My stomach lurched as though I had swallowed a shard of ice. I screamed something incoherent, his name, or maybe just a sound of distress. I pushed through the bystanders, panic building with each step. The crowd's interpretation of events filtered toward me in fragments. I heard someone say, "He tried to kidnap a baby." Another voice, "Just wait for the cops." I looked around wildly, trying to locate our daughter. Where was she? I saw a woman walking briskly across the parking lot, a baby carrier dangling from her arm. A wave of relief struck me at first glance. I thought maybe this kind stranger had rescued our child from a mugger. In my confusion, I assumed my husband was the victim of a robbery, and that this woman had intervened to shield the baby from harm. My mind simply could not process the reality that this well-dressed stranger was the culprit. I ran toward the group, restraining my husband, heart hammering so hard I could hardly breathe. "Stop it!" I yelled. "What are you doing? Let him go! What's happening?" I must have sounded hysterical. My voice rose in pitch, and I waved my wallet at them, an absurd gesture of surrender and negotiation. "Please, if you're robbing him, take everything. Just leave us alone. Don't hurt him." One of the men holding my husband down looked up, confusion knitting his brow. "Lady," he said, voice stern, "we're not robbing him. He tried to kidnap that woman's baby." He pointed toward the retreating figure of the well-dressed woman with the carrier, who was now halfway across the parking lot and moving faster. My mind spun. I stared at him, incredulous. "What are you talking about?" I blurted. "That's our baby." The words felt thick and heavy on my tongue. I couldn't make sense of the scene. How could anyone believe my husband was a kidnapper? The man grimaced as if he had trouble believing me. I saw others shake their heads. Some looked uncertain now, my sudden appearance injecting doubt into their certainty. Still, no one moved. No one chased the woman. Time slowed. The world narrowed to a tunnel of desperate focus. I could see the woman receding into the distance, weaving between cars, her figure steady and intent. If she reached her vehicle and drove off, I might never see my baby again. The thought exploded in my mind, triggering a feral surge of adrenaline. I didn't have time for explanations. I didn't have time to correct their misunderstandings. All I knew was I had to stop her. I kicked off my heels, literally leapt out of them so I could run faster, and sprinted. The pavement was rough against my bare feet, but I didn't feel the pain. My blood roared in my ears. I dodged around a slow-moving sedan leaving the lot and ignored the shouts behind me. As I closed the distance, I could see my baby's carrier swaying precariously in the stranger's grasp. My daughter's wails were frantic now, high-pitched sobs that stabbed at my heart. The woman didn't look back. I launched myself at her, grabbing the first thing I could, her hair. It was softer and smoother than I expected, slipping through my fingers, but I managed to get a good grip near her scalp. I tugged hard. She stumbled. With my other hand, I reached for her throat, not to choke her, but to hold her in place, to stop her from escaping. I was utterly untrained in self-defense. I had never even raised a hand against anyone before. But in that moment, I would have done anything. My baby's life was at stake. My grip was awkward and she was strong. She twisted, trying to wrench free. The carrier swung wildly, and I gasped in terror at the thought of it falling. "Give me my baby!" I screamed, voice cracking. She kicked backward, catching my shin. The pain made me cry out, but I didn't let go. I yanked harder on her hair, and that sudden sharp pain must have surprised her. She cursed under her breath, her calm facade shattered, and let go of the carrier's handle. The baby, our precious bundle of innocence, dropped onto the pavement with a jolt. I threw myself forward, flinging my entire body over the carrier like a protective shield. I didn't care that I scraped my knees and elbows. I didn't care that my dress tore. All that mattered was covering my child, ensuring she could not be taken again. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. I stayed there, hunched, sobbing, pressing my forehead to the hard plastic of the carrier's handle. My baby shrieked inside, terrified, and I whispered, it's okay, Mommy's here," though I could barely force the words out. When I finally looked up, the woman was gone, slipped through the lanes of cars. I caught a glimpse of her skirt and blouse as she vanished between two SUVs. Later, I would wonder at the bizarre lack of pursuit. Didn't anyone think it strange that this so-called mother had fled without her supposed child? At the time, the crowd was still focused on my husband, or too shocked to react quickly. By the time some of them realized the story wasn't adding up, she was long gone. It was only then that I began shouting words that made sense. "She tried to take my baby! That woman tried to kidnap my baby!" My voice rang out over the asphalt. Some bystanders began to murmur. "Wait, what? But I thought," the guy said. Confusion spread through the group. I rose slowly, cradling the carrier to my chest and rocking it, tears streaming down my face. I hobbled back toward my husband, who was still pinned down. At my frantic insistence, screeching at them that they had helped the kidnapper escape, some of the bystanders began to let up. The man who had tackled my husband stood, looking ashamed and horrified. My husband coughed, struggling to his feet, one arm wrapped protectively around his ribs. His eyes were red with panic and fury. He limped toward me, and we stood there trembling, reunited but shaken to the core. Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance. The police had been called, and soon cruisers pulled into the parking lot. Officers emerged, crisp uniforms and wary eyes scanning the scene. People rushed up to them, all talking at once, painting a picture of chaos. The officers raised their hands, ordering everyone to calm down. At this point, I expected the ordeal to get easier. The police would realize what had happened. They would take our statements, review security footage, and promise to search for the woman. But that was not what happened. Instead, the police seemed skeptical. They separated my husband and me. Two officers pulled him aside, asking him sternly what had happened, while another two came to talk to me. I was still trembling, holding our baby close. She had calmed slightly now, whimpering softly, as if sensing my distress. The questioning began with a strange tilt. Rather than focusing on the criminal act just attempted, the officers peppered me with odd, insinuating questions. "Does your husband look very different from your daughter?" one asked, glancing at the baby's features. I felt heat bloom in my cheeks, anger rising. Why did that matter? "He looks like her father," I said. "Because he is her father." The officer nodded vaguely, and tried another angle. Is it possible the woman thought she was intervening? Maybe she believed your husband was hurting the baby, and she tried to protect her? I stared at him, incredulous. She picked up my baby without a word and walked away. She didn't scream until he tried to stop her. If she was concerned, she could have asked or called the police. She wouldn't have fled. But even as I said this, I noticed how the officer's gaze slipped away, as though searching for a more palatable explanation. Another officer chimed in. Could the woman have been confused? Could she have thought the baby was hers, or that your husband was someone else? I struggled for a calm tone. How many possibilities do we need before we accept the obvious truth? She tried to kidnap my child. Meanwhile, my husband was facing similar challenges. I could see him 20 feet away, his posture tense, one arm wrapped around his torso. He must have been in pain, but the officers didn't seem overly concerned. I later learned that they asked him if he had argued with the woman, if he had tried flirting with her and made her uncomfortable, or if he had done something inappropriate to the child, causing her to rescue the baby. He recounted this to me afterward, voice shaking with rage and disbelief. I tried to remain composed and follow the lawyer's advice. My brother-in-law's colleague, who we called after finally getting a shaky connection. But at the time, I knew nothing except that I had to make these officers understand. Check the store's security cameras, I insisted. They must have caught the whole thing. You'll see she walked right up and took my baby. The officers exchanged glances. One of them sighed heavily and wrote something down on his notepad. Another ran a hand over his short-cropped hair. They were stalling, it seemed, afraid to conclude that a near abduction had just taken place under their noses. Perhaps such a thing seemed too brazen. Maybe they were accustomed to misunderstandings and overreactions. Maybe they assumed we were exaggerating. But their reluctance to investigate the truth made my blood boil. I turned toward the bystanders. Some had drifted away after the police arrived, unwilling to be involved further. Those who remained looked uncertain, embarrassed. A few still glared at my husband, despite everything. One man even murmured loudly enough for me to hear. They should call CPS to make sure that's really their baby. My husband's jaw tightened at that, and I felt a surge of protective fury. How could anyone still doubt us after seeing the woman flee empty-handed? The police took descriptions of the woman. I noted every detail I could. The color of her blouse, the brand of her handbag, the subtle perfume I caught a whiff of as I grabbed her hair. My husband described her height, the shape of her face, the sound of her voice. I urged them to take down the license plates of every vehicle leaving the lot around the time, but they dismissed the idea as impractical. At some point, one of the officers shifted tactics. He tried to calm me down by saying, "Ma'am, if she really intended to kidnap your baby, why would she do it in broad daylight at a busy store?" I stared at him, speechless. Predators don't always follow logic. The world is full of inexplicable cruelty. Just because it defied his neat view of the world didn't mean it hadn't happened. When I found my voice, I said, "I don't know." But she did. I asked them if they'd review the security footage immediately. After some nudging, one officer finally agreed to go inside and speak with the store's management. Another officer took my husband's statement more thoroughly. Only when I mentioned that we had already reached out to a lawyer, my husband managed to get a call through to his brother, who in turn connected him to someone with legal expertise, did the officers seem to shift their demeanor. They realized we would not be easily placated and dismissed. The presence of legal counsel, even implied, prodded them into action. They asked the store manager to preserve the tapes. They gave us their names and badge numbers after I insisted, repeatedly, that we needed this information for our records. Initially, one officer looked annoyed by the request, but I stood firm. My knees still stung from my earlier fall, and my heart felt like it would never return to a normal rhythm, but I would not be bullied into silence. Eventually, we were allowed to leave. The ambulance that arrived to assess my husband's injuries confirmed he had 2 cracked ribs from the vicious kick delivered by one of the men who subdued him. That same man stood nearby, remorse etched into his face, apologizing over and over. He said he thought he was saving a child. My husband, always the more forgiving one, shook his head and said, "I know you thought you were doing the right thing. I'm not pressing charges. But next time, please try to understand the whole situation before you hurt someone." The man's eyes were shiny with tears, and he thanked my husband. In those surreal, painful moments, I realized how easily people can become vigilantes, joining a cause they don't fully understand, driven by an emotional narrative spun by someone with a calm voice and a nice outfit. The woman had manipulated the crowd with terrifying ease. She had known exactly how to invoke their protective instincts, and we nearly lost our daughter because of it. The officers lingered, still casting suspicious looks our way. One quietly asked if we'd like to press charges against the bystanders who assaulted my husband, but we declined. It was an impossible decision, but we were too drained, too focused on holding our family together. Besides, their actions, however misguided, stemmed from a desire to protect a child. As we left, I could still feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on us, some filled with lingering doubt, others with shame or awkward sympathy. 1 or 2 looked angry that their heroic narrative had been shattered. I clutched the baby carrier, feeling my daughter's small weight shifting inside. She was calmer now, exhausted by her ordeal, drifting into uneasy sleep. I ran my fingers along her cheek, promising silently that I would protect her better, that I would never let something like this happen again. Back in the car, my husband and I just stared at each other. His eyes glistened. My throat was too tight to speak. When the words finally came, they were jumbled, stumbling expressions of love, relief, and disbelief. We cried together, shaking violently from the adrenaline and shock. This was supposed to be a simple grocery trip, a mundane errand, and it had turned into a nightmare that defied reason. That evening, after we got our older kids from school, we tried to maintain a veneer of normalcy. We didn't want to scare them, but they sensed something was off, asked why Daddy was moving carefully, holding his side. We told them there had been an accident in the parking lot. Later, once they were in bed, my husband and I sat on the couch in the darkened living room, holding hands, replaying the incident over and over in our minds. The "what ifs" gnawed at us. What if I'd taken longer in the store? What if the woman had managed to reach her minivan first? The thought of never seeing our daughter again, of some stranger raising her or harming her, threatened to tear my sanity apart. My husband, who had always been calm under pressure, now struggled with quiet rage. He felt helpless and humiliated. He had been beaten, restrained, made a spectacle of, while the real criminal slipped away. The next day, we followed up with the police, ensuring that the security footage was not lost and that a proper investigation would be conducted. We demanded to speak with higher-ups until someone took us seriously. Over the ensuing weeks, we made sure every officer's name and badge number was on record, and we documented everything meticulously. My husband's ribs would heal, but our trust in the world's decency had been shaken. I would find myself looking over my shoulder in parking lots, scanning for that woman's face, wondering if she might try again, or if someone like her lurked in every unexpected corner. To my knowledge, the investigation never yielded a suspect. The woman vanished as quickly as she had appeared. The police seemed to lose interest after their initial interviews. Perhaps this was the easiest outcome for them. No messy charges, no complicated headlines, just an unresolved anomaly. We considered hiring a private investigator, but ultimately decided against it, focusing instead on our family's healing. What remains with me, to this day, is the staggering cruelty and cunning of that stranger, and how readily a crowd of ordinary people helped her commit a crime. The sunny afternoon, the mild breeze, the scent of cut grass. These details that should have contributed to a pleasant memory are now tainted by dread and disbelief. I have come to understand that in a single moment, narratives can be flipped, heroes mistaken for villains, and vice versa. The truth can be drowned out by a well-timed scream. But in the end, we survived. We reclaimed our daughter. We went home together and cried, and thanked every mercy in the universe that we got her back. And we learned a painful, unforgettable lesson about how fragile our sense of safety can be, and how dearly we must hold on to what we cherish most in the world. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and click the bell.